Hello, everyone. This is Sam, and today we are going to talk about The Long Walk by Stephen King. This is going to be my first really true book review. All my previous videos have been like my introduction to BookTube and my participation in book events. So this one is going to really be my first true book review because it's not part of an event. I was actually just reading this story a couple weeks ago, and uh, I still had it checked out from a library and haven't returned it yet. So yeah, kind of want to finish this, get my thoughts about this out, so I can get this copy back to my local library. Um, And the way I'm going to do this review is that I'm going to do it like in a real basic review format. I'm going to talk about the positives of the story, the negatives of it, give a final ranking uh, that will be in a like 5-star ranking, and also any inspiration that I got from the story that I might use in my own writing. If you saw my introduction video, you know that I'm a working writer, so sort of discussing the stories I read and how they might inspire me is something that I really wanted to talk about because it's something that I'm sure other booktubers who are writers have done it, but I just haven't seen it done as often uh, because I just haven't seen it. I'm relatively new to booktube, so maybe it's more discussed and shown than I'm assuming. But yeah, I want to discuss if I got any inspiration from this story. I actually had to reshoot this episode because I shot it a day or two ago, but I kept slamming this book down every time I was done talking because I'm so used to speaking on like a Yeti microphone, which doesn't usually pick up noises that way. But because I'm using a computer speaker, every time I slam this down on my desk right here, the audio peaked. So we're gonna try and avoid that. Uh, as for why I was reading this story a couple of weeks ago, I mainly did it because the film adaptation of The Long Walk came out last year. Uh, and it had an interesting trailer, and I saw that, oh, this was written by Stephen King, and, a Stephen King adaptation is not a unique thing. There's almost always one or two out within 2 or 3 years. I think there was a point where there was one coming out every year, but the story looked interesting as the film trailer showed it, and I was like, well, let me see if I can read the book first, and because I really like reading books before the movies come out or the film adaptations. I actually haven't seen the Long Walk movie yet, just because I wanted to read the book first, because I like comparing, contrasting, seeing whether I like the movies as they are adapted, or maybe I don't like them. And sometimes I watch a movie that's an adaptation and I go, oh yeah, I actually like this more than the book. Uh, doesn't happen a lot, but it does happen occasionally. So, to get into the nitty gritty of The Long Walk, as I said before, this was written by Stephen King. Stephen King does not need an introduction. Even if you're not big on BookTube or even big on books, you probably know who Stephen King is. He's a very well-known horror author. Uh, though this story, though it does have horror elements, is not technically a horror story. The Long Walk was published in 1979, and it is set in a dystopian version of the United States where a tyrannical regime controls the country And every year they have a contest where 100 young men do a marathon. And it's a simple marathon, it's just a walking contest. And it starts at the Canadian border in northern Maine. The contest goes that you keep walking. But not just you keep walking, you walk without stopping for anything. That includes bathroom breaks, sleeping. You just keep walking. And the contest goes until the last man standing. And there's only one man standing at the end because anybody who stops walking or breaks any of the rules, they are immediately shot. So only one person wins the long walk. And in true dystopian fashion, the losers do not get a fun exit. As the description probably lets a lot of people know, this was inspired by real life death marches that were done throughout history. The one that was probably most inspirational was the Bataan Death March. That was where the Japanese marched several prisoners of war for, I think it was like over 100 miles. And many people died during that march. In fact, the Bataan Death March is mentioned by name in this story. So, the main character of the story is a guy named Ray Garrity, who is from Maine, and he joins the walk for kind of unknown reasons. We aren't really sure why, but we do learn in the story why, and it's an interesting reason. But the most interesting thing about this story is that it is one of the Stephen King stories that was originally not written under his name. If you got a good enough browser or computer, you probably saw a little byline under Stephen King's name. And it's hard to see on my camera, but it says writing as Richard Bachman. And Richard Bachman was a pseudonym King used in the 1970s and 1980s when he wanted to write and publish stories that didn't really fit into his horror fiction type, like the stories he wrote. Some of it was because he wanted to have a little more artistic freedom. He didn't want to be pigeonholed as a horror writer. But it was also partially because at the time, his publishers had a request that he only publish one book a year. Essentially because they didn't want to flood the market with Stephen King books and sort of cheapen his name and brand. So Richard Bachman was kind of a way for King to get around that. And he only used the Richard Bachman pen name for five novels from 1977 to 1984. And the reason was because there was a clerk who worked for the publishing house who put together that, oh, hey, all these checks for Richard Bachman keep going to the address that has Stephen King has. Like, what's up with that? And so he was outed pretty quick, and King sort of dropped the pen name because it wasn't useful anymore. But what's interesting is that while King did do novels under the Richard Bachman name, The Long Walk was actually one that he invented even before his first major success with his horror novel Carrie, because he actually wrote this during his college years when he was going to the University of Maine in the mid to late 60s. And the sources I looked up said that he wrote this in 1966 or 1967, but he didn't publish it for 13 years. And as we'll go along, you'll kind of see, yeah, this definitely feels like a story a college student wrote in the 1960s during a lot of the political turmoil of the late 60s in the United States. So this is, I believe, technically King's first written novel. Not his first published novel, but his first written novel, because this goes all the way back to his university days. Obviously, he polished it up. He did not do an immediate. He didn't release it as is. I am 95% sure he went through and edited it when he released it in 1979. So it's an interesting part of King's publishing history in that regard alone. So I guess I really want to start with the positives of the story, the stuff that I really enjoyed. And I guess the first thing that really stuck out for me was the premise. Not so much the long walk itself, but more the fact that it's set in a dystopia, but the dystopia itself is not really the main focus. It's much more focused on the characters who are in this contest and just sort of looking at how they exist in this world that is a dystopia. Um, and to sort of illustrate that, King does not really reveal how the dystopian power really came into being to take over the United States. We're not really shown they have any special military or any like military technology that would overwhelm people, or we don't really see what the social breakdown was. It just kind of exists. It does not really explain why it's there, and we're just kind of left with like a couple of hints of how maybe the regime came about, but nothing really substantial. So, focusing more on characters than the dystopia in a dystopian novel is an interesting sort of twist. Like, obviously, plenty of dystopian novels have characters in them, and the characters are the main focus, but a lot of them really are more fixated on the nature of the dystopia. Like 1984 and Brave New World talk much more about the ins and outs of the dystopia and what goes on with them, which The Long Walk really does not. So it's a very interesting take on dystopian fiction. Now, of course, the catch with that is that if you're going to do a story that's really more focused on characters than the actual world, you have to make sure that you have good characters, because otherwise people are just going to think your book is dull because you insist on focusing on the characters, but if the characters aren't interesting, that's not going to work. But I think The Long Walk does a good job with its characters because there's a good variety of them. They all have their unique methods of surviving the walk. They all have different reasons for participating. In fact, there's a lot of character types that are kind of staples of dystopian blood sports. You know, from like the Hunger Games or Battle Royale or even Stephen King's The Running Man. There's a lot of character types people will recognize in this. So, you know, you've got, for example, you've got like the Ray Garrity, the main character, who's basically meant to be the everyman. He doesn't have a really deep background. He doesn't have a romantic backstory or anything. He's very plain in that respect. So that's why he's the main character, because he's kind of the audience character, the audience surrogate. And then you have the sarcastic jerk who really does have a heart of gold with the character of Pete McVries. And Pete kind of Peeta's the most self-aware of all the walkers. He kind of knows this is all not really going to turn out well, even for the one person who comes out of it. Uh, so he's very sarcastic about the whole thing, but he does kind of come to be the sort of moral center of the group, even though he's very sardonic and doesn't really, seemingly doesn't want to help anybody, but he's very interesting in that regard. He's probably the strongest character in the story. And then, of course, with a blood sport dystopian movie, you got to have like at least one psycho in the group who is just a complete nut job who wants to cause pain and suffering to everybody. And there's a character named Gary Barkovich who fulfills that role. He basically spends a lot of the story trying to trip up the other runners, taunt them, get them off their game so that they slip up and get eliminated from the game. They call that getting your ticket. And the ticket is not a fun thing to get when it comes out of the barrel of a gun. So Gary is a psycho, but he actually has one of the more interesting character arcs, because I won't give it away, but he sort of starts to learn that being extremely hated by everyone around you, and when everyone around you has no reason to fear any punishment, given the fact they are most likely going to be ended there on that road. It turns out some of them might do something to you as well. I won't spoil it, what happens to him, but just know there's interesting consequences to his personality. And then, of course, you also have the quiet guy, and there's a guy named Stebbins who's always sort of hanging toward the back. He's got a very mysterious way about him. He rarely talks, but he has his own motives for being in the walk, so that's kind of an interesting character. Excuse me. And that's also kind of another thing, is that it's not just the individual characters, but the actual camaraderie the walkers have with each other that makes it interesting. Because the walkers all have this kind of strange relationship where they want each other to die because, well, you can't win unless everybody else dies. But there's a lot of them that actually help each other out when some of them are getting close to getting their ticket. And it could come off as contrived, but I think King does a good job at showing why these characters would save each other, even if it's not in their best interest to do so. So it's a very interesting sort of position for these characters. I also like that many of the walkers in the story die, but they often die in very non-dramatic ways. Yeah, there are some that are more dramatic, where like one character tries to fight the soldiers by climbing up on their half track, and of course he gets blown away. One guy tries to make a run for it, and of course the soldiers are watching, so they get him. But then you have others where like characters will be essentially off page. Like you'll hear mention of gunshots, and then a couple paragraphs later someone will mention, oh yeah, that was so-and-so. And even if it's like a named character or someone they talked about, and it's just sort of offhanded and everybody keeps walking. And it's like, yeah, there's a lot of deaths here where people just sort of die off screen and people just sort of roll with it because, well, they have to keep walking. So it really highlights how cheap death is in this contest. And it really shows how grim the situation is. one guy, there's even one of the biggest deaths in the story is not someone getting shot. It's just one person who drops dead. Like he walks so far that his body just stops and he drops dead. And it's like, it's actually one of the most important moments in the story because it shows how brutal this walk is, not just because soldiers might shoot you, but because your body just runs out of energy. And so it's very effective. Uh, and I also have to mention the ending, because I think the ending is actually very clever. Uh, if you know anything about Stephen King, you'll know that one of the most common criticisms he has is he's not very good with endings. Uh, a lot of people will say, oh, yeah, he has these fantastic concepts, these really gripping scenarios, but when it comes to the actual ending, he kind of falters because he doesn't quite know how to close everything out. Uh, but I'm happy to say that The Long Walk is actually pretty good with its ending. It's an ending that is both satisfying and unsatisfying. And I mean that, I don't mean unsatisfying in a bad way. I mean unsatisfying in the sense of, oh yeah, a lot of things are unresolved, but they're unresolved because this world has just made it to the point some things are going to be unresolved. So, and it's clever. I think it's clever because the story can only end in one of two ways. Either Ray Garrity wins the contest or Ray Garrity gets his ticket. And King finds a way to do one of those endings, but do it in a way that does not feel like, oh yeah, that like you just, oh yeah, that's typical. He does it in a way that is very strong, and I think it's what makes the story really work. Because if the ending was just kind of bad or even just meh, I think a lot of this story would have felt kind of pointless. So endings are very important. Uh, as a writer, I've often struggled with endings and figuring out the right way to end something because endings can make or break a story. A lot of people try to say, "Oh, well, you know, it's about the journey, not the destination." But if it's a bad destination, a lot of people are not going to be happy. So Stephen King does a satisfying ending. That should be praise enough. So, okay, we got to talk about now the things that don't work so good about this story. And the first one that really comes to mind, it's probably not the story's biggest problem, but it's the one that really stood out to me, is that Stephen King includes this sort of weird detail about the main character, Ray, having a well, there's no way to put it, but an intimate experience with another boy when they were both aged 5. And if you're going, what, to that? Yeah, that was kind of my reaction too. I'm like, what? And this was something King was kind of notorious for during this period in the 70s to like the mid 90s, where he would have these like stories that had heavy fixations about sexuality with underaged individuals. And sometimes that worked because you had stories like Carrie, which was all about like puberty and the main character's powers arising because of puberty. And it's like, okay, it made sense there. But then you have stuff like the novel It, and for those that don't know, there was a very notorious example of an underage group sex scene in It. None of the adaptations have featured it for very good reason. And it's just one of those things that anytime Stephen King does something someone really dislikes, they bring up that scene from It because it's just such a WTF. Like nobody really likes that, and it'd be very concerning if they did. Uh, so this is one of those instances where it's more It than Carrie, in my opinion, because the moment just kind of feels like it's there for shock value than like being something that needs to legitimately be there for artistic value. Like, I am not a prude. I know that uh, sensual topics sometimes do need to be discussed in fiction and nonfiction, but it does not feel necessary here, especially because King spends a lot of the story trying to sort of emphasize that Ray is at least partially in the long walk because he's insecure about his masculinity. Because his father was taken away by the regime when he was a young boy, and he kind of had to be the man of the house with his single mother, at age 8. And it's like, yeah, that sort of does weird things to a kid. And he also has a girlfriend, but a girlfriend who won't sleep with him. And it's really emphasized, like, oh no, she wants to go steady, but she doesn't want to do that. So King has already made it clear about that Ray is kind of feeling insecure in his masculinity, and so it kind of feels like excess to like include that event happening with the other boy when they were both 5. It just kind of feels like, oh, King sort of doing his shock value sex thing where it is really not necessary. So that part really stuck out to me. It's kind of like, what are we doing here, King? And the second biggest criticism that I have is that the actual concept of the long walk kind of wears itself out by the last 100 pages or so. You could make the argument that that's part of the intent. It's supposed to show how long and grueling the walk is, but it's kind of... You kind of get the point by the 10th or so chapter, the 10th or 11th, I think it was. And it just kind of feels like at a certain point the story's just sort of going on because we have to meet a certain page count. My version here is a little over 300 pages, and it just kind of feels like the story is going on because, well, it has to reach a certain point. And it's like, yeah, I excuse me. I just sort of feel like it lost momentum. So, just a second. Water does wonders for a cough. So, the concept sort of just wears thin by page 200, and most readers are going to be able to see where it's going, because it's been so emphasized that, like I said, that there's just not much of a surprise. Like I said, the ending is satisfying, but I think most people will be able to see where it's going. The final thing that really bugged me, and this probably is the most significant criticism, King tries to frame the long walk as being entertainment. Like, people line up to watch it and see the runners go by, or not the runners, the walkers, to see the walkers go by, see them, and see them get their ticket. And King is trying to emphasize this. Like, several of the chapters here have opening quotes that are from famous game shows of the time. So he is definitely trying to link in the idea of the long walk with like entertainment. But I'm sorry, I just don't really buy The Long Walk as entertainment, even by dystopian standards, because in some of the other dystopian blood sport stories I've talked about, like the Hunger Games, Battle Royale, there was sort of a gimmick to the games that would have made them interesting to watch. You know, you would have seen people like running around the island or fighting each other with weapons. But here it's just, oh yeah, here's a bunch of people who are going to be walking for a couple of days. And, you know, occasionally somebody will get shot, but it's, for the most part, just going to be these haggard guys walking. And even by the 1970s standards, I was kind of like, I feel like even a 1970s dystopian would probably be asking for more with their blood sport. It it just does not congeal. At least something with like Battle Royale or the Hunger Games, you can at least sort of see, okay, where the entertainment, as twisted as it is, you can at least understand why people would be interested in it. But here, I just don't buy it. And and of course King also did a another deadly game concept with The Running Man, which coincidentally also got a film adaptation last year. 2025 was the year of Bachman adaptations. Uh, but The Running Man had a much more interesting and believable setup for this blood sport type game. And The Long Walk just doesn't have it. So the whole idea that, oh yeah, the masses are entertained, like the television cameras are all focused on them and trying to capture every second of this event. I just don't buy it. So, so with all that in mind, what is the final ranking for this story? I'm ranking on a zero, a ranking on a 5-star rating, with 0 out of 5 stars being terrible and 5 out of 5 stars being fantastic. And I would say The Long Walk is a 3 out of 5 stars, which is average, pleasantly average. It's more good than it's bad. So it's a positive review. And I would say that this is a good story to read if you are a dystopian fan, but if you're a dystopian fan who like is really interested in character writing, where you really want to see a story that's carried more by the characters than the actual world. If you're looking for that kind of story, I think this will really do it for you. But I also say it's 3 out of 5 stars because I think it's only really worth the reading once. Because when I read this story and I was done with it, I kind of went, yeah, I'm not really sure I want to read it again. Not necessarily because of its brutality, though it is a brutal story. It doesn't have much more than what it presents. It's about a guy who goes in a dystopian walking contest. He learns some stuff about himself and others, and the contest goes like you think it would. There's just not much in the way of subtext or any like deeper meaning that I think a lot of people would find interesting. What you see is what you get, which is both a good and bad thing. Good in that it's straightforward and easy to understand, but I just don't think it really has much in the way of rereadability. You know, maybe that'll be wrong. Maybe in 5 years it'll be like, oh, I have to go back to The Long Walk, but I just don't see it being one that many people would revisit. So did I get any inspiration from this story? No, I didn't. For the simple reason that I'm really interested in like fantastical concepts. Dystopias are fantastical, you usually want to have something a little more to them. You know, something like a cyberpunk dystopia or a tyrant in a fantasy kingdom. There has to be a certain fantastic quality to it to really get me interested. Uh, and The Long Walk just shows a rather mundane dystopia, one that exists as how like the 1970s would exist. It's 1970s America with a dystopian regime. It's like, yeah, it's straightforward and just not really fantastical. It works for the story, but it just doesn't interest me much in my writing sensibilities. So, not really any inspiration for myself from this story. So, this sounds like a story you'd be into. You can probably find it at your local library. I mean, Stephen King is not a hard to find author. Uh, and even if you can't, there's several copies online that you can find if you really want to read this. So, yeah, I'd give a slight recommendation if you want to read that kind of dystopian novel. But yeah, that's my review for The Long Walk, and I hope this interests you and you have a fun time reading it. Well, maybe not a fun time, but an invigorating time reading it if you decide to read it. So, thank you for watching, and goodbye.